On October 9, 1988, Gayle Barrus, a single mother from Battle Creek, Michigan, disappeared after working her regular shift. Barrus was employed at two locations, the Beer Keg in Battle Creek and the Redwood Inn in Augusta. She worked these two jobs to support her three children. The last confirmed sighting of Barrus placed her at Speed's coffee shop on West Michigan Avenue between 3 and 4 a.m. on the morning of October 9th. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her leave the establishment with a dark-haired man. After that point, no one reported seeing her alive again. When Barrus failed to return home, her children became concerned. Her son, James Barrus, was 13 years old at the time. The family waited for her to come home, but she never arrived. James later recalled that it was completely out of character for his mother to disappear without explanation or contact with her children. A search was initiated by local law enforcement. The search continued for 16 days with no results. On October 25, 1988, hunters discovered a body in a wooded area in Emmett Township along River Road. The body was identified as Gayle Barrus. James Barrus and his siblings were picked up from school by their father that day. Their father did not immediately tell them what had happened. Once they were in the vehicle in the school parking lot, he informed them that their mother had been found dead. He told them she had been raped and stabbed. James described this moment as one that would define the rest of their lives. The investigation into Gayle Barrus's death began immediately. In 1988, DNA technology existed but was not widely used in criminal investigations and was not well understood by most law enforcement agencies. Investigators collected physical evidence from the crime scene and from Barrus's body, but they were unable to identify a suspect using the technology and methods available at that time. 2 days before Gayle Barrus's body was discovered, Battle Creek police were involved in a shooting incident with a 24-year-old man named Roger Plato. Plato was a suspect in a separate rape case. When officers attempted to apprehend him, he fled from them. Officers discharged their weapons during the pursuit. Roger Plato was killed in this incident on October 23, 1988. At the time, investigators did not connect Roger Plato to the Gayle Barrus case. The timing made this connection unlikely, as Plato was killed 2 days before Barrus's body was found. Following standard procedure, Plato's body was cremated shortly after his death. His remains were scattered, which meant that his DNA was no longer available for testing. However, this was not entirely accurate. A blood sample from Roger Plato had been collected and stored. This sample was preserved at the county sheriff's office, though it was not immediately utilized in the investigation of Gayle Barrus's murder. The case remained unsolved. Days turned into weeks, then months, then years. James Barrus grew up without his mother. He graduated from high school, started his own family, and tried to live with the loss. His mother's case file remained open with the Battle Creek Police Department. The Battle Creek Police Department's Robbery Homicide Division maintained files on numerous cold cases. Detective Marshall was assigned a caseload that included over 60 unsolved homicide cases dating back to the 1960s. Each of these cases represented families still waiting for answers and justice. In 2020, more than 30 decades after Gayle Barrus's murder, Detective Marshall received the vial of blood that had been stored from Roger Plato. By this time, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Tests that were impossible or unreliable in 1988 had become standard procedure. DNA databases had been established that allowed for comparison of genetic material from crime scenes with samples from known individuals. Detective Marshall submitted the blood sample from Roger Plato to the Michigan State Police Laboratory for DNA analysis. He also submitted the evidence that had been collected from Gayle Barrus's body in 1988. The laboratory conducted a comparison between Plato's DNA and the DNA evidence from the murder. The results came back positive for a match. The statistical probability of the match being incorrect was calculated. On one genetic marker, the odds of the match being coincidental were 1 in 770 trillion. On another marker, the odds were 1 in 1.3 billion. These statistics effectively eliminated any reasonable doubt that the DNA belonged to Roger Plato. The conclusive match linked Roger Plato to the rape and murder of Gayle Barrus. Investigators reviewed the timeline and determined that Plato had been alive at the time of Barrus's death. He lived in the Battle Creek area and would have had the opportunity to encounter her. When James Barrus was informed of the results, he was 45 years old. He had waited 32 years, 3 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days for answers about who killed his mother. The total time elapsed was 11,797 days, or 1,685 weeks, or 387 months. James stated that he was still trying to process the information and that it was difficult to comprehend after so many years. However, the resolution of the case presented challenges. Roger Plato was dead since October 23, 1988. There could be no arrest, no trial, and no criminal prosecution. Plato could not be held accountable in a court of law because he was no longer alive. Investigators also identified another individual who may have been involved in the case. A man named Richard Compton had been seen with Roger Plato around the time of Gayle Barrus's disappearance. Witnesses placed them together during the relevant time period. Investigators believed that Compton may have been present during the crime or may have had knowledge of what occurred and failed to report it to authorities. If Richard Compton had been alive, he would likely have faced criminal charges. These charges could include accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, or possibly more serious charges depending on the extent of his involvement. However, Compton had also died years before the case was solved. He died homeless and suffering from medical conditions including cirrhosis of the liver and sepsis. The prosecutor for Calhoun County reviewed the evidence and the DNA results. Based on the conclusive DNA match and the investigative findings, the prosecutor officially closed the case of Gayle Barrus's murder. The case was marked as solved, with Roger Plato identified as the killer and Richard Compton identified as a potential accomplice. Both men were deceased and could not be prosecuted. James Barrus provided his perspective on the outcome. He noted that if Plato or Compton had been alive, the family would have had to endure a criminal trial. He pointed out that even with DNA evidence, convictions are not guaranteed. After 32 years, eyewitnesses either had died or their memories had faded to the point where their testimony might not be reliable. Physical evidence can degrade over time. Jury trials introduce uncertainty regardless of the strength of the evidence. James stated that given these factors, he was satisfied with the resolution. He felt that the identification of his mother's killer provided the closure his family needed, even without a trial or conviction. He expressed that knowing who was responsible was more important than pursuing a legal case that might have resulted in an acquittal due to the passage of time. The Gayle Barrus case represents one example of how advances in forensic science have allowed law enforcement to resolve cold cases that were previously unsolvable. DNA technology that was experimental or unavailable in 1988 is now standard practice in criminal investigations. Biological evidence that was collected and preserved decades ago can now be analyzed and compared against databases containing millions of profiles. The Battle Creek Police Department continues to investigate cold cases using modern forensic techniques. Evidence from unsolved crimes is periodically reviewed and reanalyzed as technology improves. Cases that appeared to have no leads in previous decades may yield results when examined with current methods. Gayle Barrus was 32 years old when she was killed. She left behind 3 children who grew up without her mother. Roger Plato was 24 years old when he committed the murder and when he was killed by police 2 days before her body was discovered. The connection between them was not established until DNA technology advanced sufficiently to make the identification possible.
James Barrus and his siblings finally received answers about their mother's death in 2021, 32 years after her murder. The case was officially closed, with Roger Plato identified as the killer and Richard Compton identified as a potential accomplice. Both men were deceased and could not be prosecuted.
On August 30th, 1980, Stephanie Sommers was murdered in her apartment at 3500 Marathon Street in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. She was 36 years old and had recently moved to the area from Newhall. Sommers was supposed to pick up her nephew, Kelly, that day for a belated birthday trip to Magic Mountain. When family members couldn't reach her by phone over the following days, they grew concerned and contacted authorities. When police entered the apartment, they found evidence of a violent struggle. A rug on the living room wall was knocked askew. A cigarette butt was found inside the entryway. Items were scattered throughout the apartment, including panties, a broken necklace, and a pair of rose-tinted glasses found in a litter box. Blood was present at the scene. The kitchen knife drawer was open and empty. Stephanie's body was located in the bedroom, partially covered by towels and sheets. She had suffered blunt force trauma to her head, including a fractured skull and a deep gash on her forehead. An 8-pound weight was found near her body and was determined to be the weapon used in the assault. She had also been stabbed 16 times in the torso. A kitchen knife was found on her chest. She was found wearing only a bra. Evidence collected at the scene included vaginal swabs that indicated she had been sexually assaulted. However, in 1980, DNA technology was not available for criminal investigations. The case was assigned to the LAPD Robbery Homicide Division, but no arrests were made. The investigation eventually went cold. Kelly was 11 years old when his aunt was killed. His mother sent him out of the house when police called with the news. A neighbor told him that his aunt had been murdered. Stephanie's sister Sheridan and their mother also grieved the loss. Their mother died in 2002 without knowing who killed her daughter. In April 1981, 8 months after Stephanie's death, Harold Anthony Parkinson shot and killed a man named Derek Eugene Perry in Los Angeles. Parkinson was 24 years old at the time. He was convicted of Perry's murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He began serving his sentence on March 5, 1982 at Chuckawalla Valley State Prison. Parkinson had lived less than 1 mile from Stephanie Sommers in Silver Lake. In 2014, LAPD cold case detectives re-examined evidence from Stephanie's case using modern DNA technology. The vaginal swabs that had been preserved for 34 years were analyzed. The DNA profile from the semen sample was entered into criminal databases and matched to Harold Anthony Parkinson, who was already incarcerated for the 1981 murder of Derek Eugene Perry. On June 19, 2014, detectives arrested Parkinson for Stephanie's murder. He was arraigned on 1 count of murder with the special circumstance allegation of rape. The DNA match had a probability of 1 in 1.3 billion of being someone other than Parkinson. The case went to trial in October 2019. Deputy District Attorney Lowry Mendoza prosecuted the case. Defense attorney Jesus Lopez acknowledged the DNA evidence but argued that the sexual encounter could have been consensual. He contended there was no evidence placing Parkinson in the apartment during the murder itself. The prosecution's strategy focused on proving the encounter was not consensual. Mendoza presented evidence that Stephanie Sommers was gay and would not have willingly engaged in sexual activity with Parkinson. This was difficult to establish given the passage of time and the social climate of 1980, when many LGBTQ individuals were not open about their sexuality. One of Stephanie's former co-workers testified that in 1980, discussion of sexuality was kept quiet because it wasn't as accepted as it is today. Kelly, now 52, testified about his close relationship with his aunt, but noted she could be private about her personal life. Evidence showed Stephanie had been briefly married to a man in the early 1970s and had participated in a threesome with a married couple during that period. However, friends testified that Stephanie had told them she was a lesbian and identified as gay. This made a consensual sexual encounter with Parkinson implausible. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder. They found the special circumstance allegation of murder during rape to be true. They also found true the allegations that Parkinson used a weight and a knife in the commission of the crime. The jury was not informed during the trial that Parkinson was already serving time for the 1981 murder of Derek Perry. Outside the jury's presence, Parkinson admitted to a second special circumstance allegation of murder with a prior murder conviction. On June 19, 2014, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy sentenced Parkinson. Sheridan Roberts, Stephanie's sister, read a statement describing her sister as a force for good. Judge Kennedy called the crime very degrading, horrible, and violent, and stated she believed the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Parkinson was responsible. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Parkinson appealed the conviction. In May 2022, California's 2nd District Court of Appeals reviewed the case. The 3-justice panel found the evidence of guilt to be overwhelming. They determined that forensic evidence proved Stephanie was either raped and then murdered, or rendered unconscious or killed and then raped. The appeal was denied. Harold Anthony Parkinson remains in prison, serving a life sentence without parole. He has not confessed to the crime. The case remained unsolved for 34 years before DNA technology provided the evidence needed to identify and convict Stephanie Sommers' killer. Kelly Roberts was 50 years old when the case was finally resolved in court, 39 years after his aunt's death.